administration getting data records from reporters. I remember Mort Halprin, the Halprins had their home phone line bugged for 19, 20, 21 months. He was a member of the Nixon administration, and they bugged his phone for 21 months. And now we're finding out that Don McGahn was also targeted by the Trump administration. And you're hearing Barr, Sessions, and all of these other Trump administration officials saying they knew nothing about it. So it seems that here we are 50 years later, reading stories that sound a lot like they came out of 1971, 1972.
Oh, absolutely. You know, the phrase for, I think it was Howard Hunt who called the most of Watergate is the White House horrors, right? It was just one thing after another. And to me, the great lesson of Watergate is it was a case where the system broke and then the system repaired itself. And this is hugely important for where we are now, right? Because it was Barry Goldwater, right? It was John Rhodes. It was Republicans in the House and in the Senate. And to go to your Barr Sessions point, Elliot Richardson and Bill Ruckelshaus and people in the Justice Department who said, no, the Constitution is more important than the passing temporary favor of the occupant of the White House. That sounds very grand, but these guys did it in real time. They broke with their party. They broke with their personal interests and put the Constitution ahead of their personal interests and their party interests. That's not some Homeric ode to lost golden bipartisanship. This is not that. It's a real human drama. It was a close-run thing, as Wellington said of Waterloo, but they did it. So the question now is, who are those Republicans in the House and in the Senate and in the Justice Department, when the pendulum swings again, who will in fact stand up and say, no, the system is more important than my personal interests?
Well, and Susan Page, there's quite a bit of reporting to do right now. The question is, if Barr, if Sessions, if they weren't involved in this, if they didn't approve this, then who approved the bugging of phones, the collection of data, phone data, from political opponents in the opposing party? And now, again, this morning we're hearing about Don McGahn, who was the person that recommended the same thing inside the Trump administration. If the attorneys general at the time didn't support that move.
So if the attorneys general, if it's true, as they are saying, that they didn't know, is that reassuring or is it alarming? Because somebody knew that they were going after
alarming.
The records of Democratic members of Congress and of the sitting White House counsel. You know, if you're thinking about echoes of Watergate, think about an enemies list, because this is, look, we need to know more, we need to investigate, but this is looking like there was an enemies list in the Trump Justice Department against critics of President Trump, not because of national security grounds, but because of political considerations. So very much, we are not, 50 years have passed, but we're not in a new and different place.
Susan Page and John Meacham, thank you very much. And Kurt Anderson, thank you as well. The new podcast is entitled Nixon at War.
I can't wait. Can't wait to listen to that. That's going to be extraordinary.
Fantastic. World leaders, as we're a few minutes past the top of the hour, wrapped up the G7 summit over the weekend, pledging to face adversaries together. President Biden urged the leaders to take a harsher public stance against autocratic countries like China and Russia. The group of 7 leaders also agreed to work together to combat the continuing coronavirus global health crisis and climate change as well. And now it's on to the NATO summit. With us from the side of that summit in Brussels, traveling with the president, is White House reporter for the Associated Press, Jonathan Lemire. Actually, we just lost Jonathan Lemire, so we'll get back to Jonathan in just a moment. But Richard Haass is with us.
And Richard, I really like how the Biden administration has set this up after 4 years of a Trump administration that tried to shake things up. They had their theory of the case, and that was that the United States depended too much on NATO, depended too much on G7, that we were carrying the load too much. Of course, I think you and I disagreed with that approach. So I like what the Biden administration has done. They start first with a special relationship, meet with Boris Johnson, make sure that everything's okay there. They then get the G7 together. Now they're meeting with NATO. They're really lining everything up, I think, strategically, so they can go with a united front to their meeting, Joe Biden's meeting with Vladimir Putin. What do you think?
No, I think that's exactly the logic of the progression. First was the United States to somewhat get itself back on its feet, and the response to COVID, the economic recovery. Then go overseas, building from the UK to the G7, now with NATO. Next will be the EU. Essentially, we'll check the boxes of our principal allied relations. And what you'll see is for the next 24 hours, a lot of the focus will be on Russia, to some extent China, on defense. You've already seen the focus on COVID. You've seen the focus on climate. What essentially you're seeing is a preparing of the table for the meeting with Putin on Wednesday, and ultimately for a meeting with Xi Jinping. And I think that's why I don't like to use the word summit for the meeting with Putin, Joe. That right now the U.S.-Russian relationship, as important as it is, and Biden obviously wants to stabilize it, create a floor under it, but that's not the main event. This, in some ways, the reason he wants to stabilize it and put a floor on it, under it, is because the main event is China. And that for this administration is the centerpiece of its foreign policy. So over the next couple of days, in the back of our minds, we ought to be thinking, not simply how does this provide a context for a meeting with Putin that's hopefully, again, stabilizes this relationship. But if you can do that, then it frees us up to deal more with China.
So let me ask you about, we had Ambassador John Bolton on last week saying he probably should not have set this meeting up with Vladimir Putin yet. I'm wondering whether this was premature, whether Putin had done really, of course, nothing to deserve an audience with the President of the United States, and whether we actually are elevating him beyond a point where he needs to be elevated. Should we have just had these meetings, gone back, then had a meeting with President Xi?
I would say no. I actually think the meeting is warranted. I've never thought diplomacy is a favor we're bestowing. We ought to have confidence. It's a tool of our own national security. It's important to manage the relations with our European allies that we're also seen as talking to Vladimir Putin. And again, we do not want to have a major crisis with Russia. I think part of the purpose of this meeting is not to agree on things. It's just to communicate. We do not want Putin to miscalculate. We do not want, for example, him to think he's got a free hand in dealing with the Baltics or any part of NATO. We want him to know he's potentially going to pay a price if he keeps doing certain things in cyberspace. And that's important. So again, hopefully it gets him to think twice, and then it does free us up for, among other things, dealing with China. But no, I don't think this is premature. And you could end up, for example, Joe, with renewed consular presence. We want to have a normal relationship with Russia. There's no big upside here. But I do think there's an avoidance of a terrible downside. And that's not, sometimes in foreign policy, it's not what you accomplish, it's what you avoid. And I think that's the box I would put this in.
Jonathan Lemire is with us now. We have his shot up. Jonathan, what does the Biden administration hope to accomplish in NATO, with the NATO summit?
Morning, Joe, or this afternoon here. Yes, I'm at NATO. You can see, don't let them ever tell you this job's not glamorous. Here at NATO headquarters, the cinder block backdrop, masks are required, vaccination rate's not nearly as high here, and just off camera, a Fanta vending machine, so I'll be sure to get one of those next. But yes, Richard summed it up correctly, that the Biden administration really, the first leg of this trip is all about unity. The G7, the world's wealthiest economies in Cornwall, England, Finland, and now here in NATO, this decades-old military alliance, trying to suggest to try to project some stability again, that you can depend on the United States again. That's his message to these leaders, saying that, with a common foe, in this case, Russia and their disruptive behavior, whether it's on cyber attacking. We're going to see an addendum, a communique later today, saying that the Article 5 powers, which of course is the Mutual Defense Pact, could be applied to cyber attacks if one country is perhaps, say, their power grid is knocked out by an element of rogue hacking, which is a noteworthy development today. And of course, the economic might of China as well in the run-up to that Putin meeting on Wednesday. So far, White House aides that I've talked to, very pleased how things have gone. They've raved about the reception that Biden has received from these Western allies and these democracies. And later today, we'll be hearing from him after he meets with Turkey's President Erdogan, with whom he has a tense relationship to this point.
All right, Jonathan Lemire, thanks so much. Greatly appreciate it. Let's go now to former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, retired 4-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He is an international security and diplomacy analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. Admiral, of course, Vladimir Putin invaded Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2016, interfered with our elections, or 2014, interfered with our elections in 2016, again in 2020. We have ransomware attacks in 2021, and yet it serves us little purpose to be provocative. So how do we, for those of us who want to have a constructive relationship with Vladimir Putin, how do we do that when we're dealing with a man who for 21 years has proven doesn't really care whether he has a constructive relationship with us?
Yeah, he's truly, deeply, madly seems to hate the United States of America, unfortunately, and it's his background. He's a KGB colonel who has ascended to power. He's not going anywhere anytime soon, and we're just going to have to deal with him. Joe, my prescription with Russia would be, look, we got to bend the parameters of this relationship because it's unacceptable right now between the litany of complaints you listed, and I'd throw in there, by the way, he supports a war criminal, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, on top of everything else you correctly mentioned. We've got to get some adjustment in our relationship. So how do you do that? I think we confront him on the hard issues and we look for zones of cooperation wherever we can find them. So example, we confront him with sanctions on human rights violations, on his continued occupation of Ukraine, on his continued support in Syria. On the other hand, we could construct some cooperation in arms control. We both want that strategically. We could find some climate ways. And I'll tell you, Joe, as we get out of Afghanistan, Russia could actually be helpful there in maintaining a lid on Taliban activity and violence. So, there are ways we can cooperate. And of course, here on the split screen, you're seeing the various heads of state and government come. I've been on that podium many times with various secretary generals. Jens Stoltenberg is doing an absolutely terrific job focusing this alliance on China with Russia, on climate, which is a growing concern for all these nations, and of course on cyber. Those are kind of the new parameters of where the alliance needs to focus, and you're seeing a Secretary General very experienced in his 5th year, really leading the alliance quite well.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up Syria in the list of things that we have reasons to be concerned about. Right now, hundreds of thousands of Syrians are starving to death. It's a war crime that's being committed against them by Assad with the help of Vladimir Putin. Is that something that Joe Biden brings up? Is that something that he presses Vladimir Putin on?
Absolutely. And look, this is anything but a summit. This is more like a crater or a dumpster in terms of the quality of the talks that are going to go on. It's going to be just, I don't want to use the term a diplomatic smackdown, but both of them are going to have a litany of complaints that they will register with the other. We've gone through the majority of the ones that we're going to put out. Vladimir Putin is going to talk about the United States has has its own problems with human rights. He'll point out George Floyd. He'll talk about incidents where African American males are shot dead by police officers. He will talk about those things. He'll also talk about our global network that in his view seems to press around Russia. He'll basically tell us, why can't you mind your own business and let us mind our own business? And of course, that's unacceptable from our perspective, and we got to count on our president, and I know he will, to stand up to that kind of talk. But it's not going to be a warm, chatty session at all.
We have more now from Keir Simmons' exclusive interview with Vladimir Putin, his first U.S. television interview in almost 3 years. In the interview, Putin laughed off a question about being threatened by opposition groups and refused to speak the name of his top critic, Alexei Navalny.
Mr. President, why are you so threatened by opposition?
Who says that I feel threatened by opposition, or we're threatened by opposition? Who told you? Who told you that? You are presenting it as dissent and intolerance towards dissent in Russia. We view it completely differently. You have mentioned the law on foreign agents, but that's not something that we invented. That law was adopted back in the 1930s in the United States, which
in America, we call what you're doing now whataboutism. What about this? What about that? It's a way of not answering the question. Will you commit that you will personally ensure that Alexei Navalny will leave prison alive?
Look, such decisions in this country are not made by the president. They're made by the court. I proceed from the premise that the person that you have mentioned, the same kind of measures will apply, not in any way worse than to anybody else who happens to be in prison.
His name is Alexei Navalny. People will note that you weren't prepared to say that he would leave prison alive.
Look, please listen to me carefully. His name can be anything. He's one of the individuals who are in prison. For me, he's one of the citizens of the Russian Federation who has been found guilty by a Russian court of law and is in prison.
Wow. Senior international correspondent Keir Simmons joins us now from Moscow. Keir, tell us more about that moment, especially when you tried to pin him down on just the name, Alexei Navalny.
Yeah, exactly, Mika. I mean, it's commented on often here in Russia that President Putin won't say Alexei Navalny's name. He has said it at times when he's really pushed to, but I think it's an insight into the psychology of President Putin about his opponents. I have to tell you, Mika, that after that 90-minute interview, President Putin continued the conversation with me. He was leaning in, making eye contact, urging me to believe him that, for example, he says the West is funding some opposition groups here in Russia. Now, you know, maybe what I was getting was the former KGB officer trying to use his powers of persuasion, or maybe, as well as being a threat, President Putin also feels threatened. And that's the kind of analysis of who the leader of this country is, this autocrat who decides everything here in many ways, including moving, by the way, the time of our interview twice. He clearly is in charge, but at the same time, how threatened does he feel? And that's the kind of analysis that President Biden and his team will need to be going through as he prepares to sit down with President Putin and thinks about the best approach. Just remember that, just for example, this is a country with thousands of nuclear weapons. This is a country that matters. It matters how America approaches this country, and how America approaches this country will have an impact on the years to come, even after President Biden is in office. That is the high stakes of this summit this week. Yeah, you know, it's so interesting here. You talked about the way Vladimir Putin was interacting with you. We know what he's going to say before he says it. We know what the Russian line is. Often, like for instance, with his meeting with Barack Obama, he was slumped over, he was rude. In other meetings and interviews, he's dour, he's defensive. What struck me about this interview was that he was laughing, he was engaged, he was trying to connect with you. And I am curious, I know you've had to think about it, I'm sure people that did the interview with you were also trying to figure out exactly what message he was trying to send out, not only to you, but also to the world.
Yeah, absolutely right. Look, in terms of the message that he's trying to send out, I think the basic answer to that is that he's trying to be listened to. There is this profound sense that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've talked about this many times, Russia felt that it wasn't being listened to. So simply sitting down for an interview and sitting down, more importantly, with the President of the United States, I think many people would say it is a win, at least inside the Kremlin behind me there. They will see it as a victory. And Joe, you're right. I actually think that his arguments are not as mysterious as perhaps they can appear. He often makes the same arguments again and again. For example, consistently coming back to what folks there call whataboutism. So you ask him about human rights, about Alexei Navalny, and he says, yeah, but what about the Capitol riots? I mean, that whataboutism came back again and again in the interview. And actually, when you see the full interview, I challenge him on it and say to him, you know, we call that whataboutism. It's a way of not answering the question, Mr. President. I also challenged him that he consistently says that countries should not interfere in other countries' domestic affairs, and yet, over the years, he has got himself in a position where he consistently comments on American domestic affairs. He brings it back again and again, as you'll see from this 90-minute interview, to America when you ask him about Russia. And again, I think that gives you a sense of a certain kind of resentment, a certain kind of psychological resentment. And again, just understanding who this person is because of his power in this country, I think is absolutely crucial.
All right. Thank you so much, Keir Simmons. Important interview. We greatly appreciate you bringing it to us this morning. Let's bring in Julia Ioffe. You know, Julia, often when people talk about Vladimir Putin, the first thing they bring up is he's a former KGB agent. When I hear him talking about George Floyd, talking about civil rights problems in the United States, well, that's exactly what Soviet leaders did back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Oh, you're talking about the Soviet Union's problems here? Well, what about your civil rights protests in the United States? Nothing new there, and also nothing new when he's saying let's not interfere with the internal affairs of each other's country. I mean, what is old is new again.
Yeah, he did, as Keir said about his interview, he did repeat a lot of the same lines over and over again. You know, that he can't decide Navalny's fate, whose name, of course, he can't mention, because that is decided by the courts. And he says it as if the courts are independent in Russia, which they're not. Of course, you know, we had Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, after his meeting with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, talking about how, you know, if America is going to bring up, if Biden's going to bring up human rights in Russia, then the Russian side is going to ask about the human rights of the protesters, the looters and rioters that stormed the Capitol on January 6th. It's interesting to note that the man who was arrested for breaking into Nancy Pelosi's office, putting his feet up on her desk, appeared on Russian TV, state TV, over the weekend, to talk about how his human rights were violated. So just as Vladimir Putin is saying we should stay out of each other's affairs, you know, he's having these people on state TV and giving them a platform.
Yeah, Admiral Stavridis, again, what is old is new again. You have, of course, useful idiots in the United States playing into the hands of our enemies or I would say not enemies, but our rivals now overseas with that interview on Russian television, but also Vladimir Putin talking about problems in the United States, that whataboutism, and also talking about the United States interfering in the internal affairs of Russia. It certainly sounds an awful lot like 1977 all over again.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also ought to remember Vladimir Putin fundamentally has a bad hand of cards, right? I mean, his country is declining by almost any measure. Population in particular, demographics are terrible. His economy is a one-trick pony, I guess a two-trick pony if you count oil and gas. His grip on power is not easing completely, but he's got internal domestic challenges as well. It's not a big hand of cards, but he's a good tactician. I'd say he's a lousy strategist, Joe. If he was strategically smart, he'd try and move Russia toward the West. That's a better option for him than becoming the junior partner in the China-Russia condominium that's kind of emerging at the moment. But it's a weak hand of cards, and like a lot of people who want to play a weak hand of cards, they tend to kind of bluff a bit, and they want to show that they're on top of their game. We ought to remember this as well, by the way, speaking of the NATO alliance. We outspend, the U.S. and our European partners, we outspend Russia by well over 10 to 1. Our combined defense budget, $700 billion U.S., about $300 billion Europe combined. Russia's defense budget is only around $70 billion. So we're outspending them significantly. Putin will point that out, by the way, to President Biden as well. But Putin does not have this towering hand of cards. He's got some aces in his nuclear programs and a few other strong suits, but frankly, he doesn't have the best hand of cards.
Admiral Stavridis, Putin just had 4 years with Donald Trump as president, in which he basically got a hall pass. He was pretty much free of the kind of U.S. pressure we've seen from every other president that's had to deal with Russia or the Soviet Union. Is this going to be a difficult adjustment for him, going back to the way the relationship generally has been, except for that 4-year interregnum?
He will be sad to see I think he regards him kind of as a friend in the form of Donald Trump depart the stage. He will be hoping to see Donald Trump come back, I'm sure of that. In the meantime, he'll kind of play rope-a-dope and hope that he can hang in there until the wheel turns, in his view, back in the United States of America. I think that he will also use social networks to continue to undermine the Biden presidency wherever he can for precisely those reasons, Gene. It's the right question to be asking.
Julia Yaffe, you have concerns about Putin getting a megaphone in interviews like these. Looking ahead to the meeting, which is set to take place on Wednesday at a villa on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland, there is going to be no joint press conference after, like there was with Trump. Although they are going to be holding, Trump and Biden and Putin are going to be holding separate news conferences. What do you make of that?
Well, I think because the last press conference that an American president did with Vladimir Putin was such an absolute disaster. If you recall Helsinki, where with the entire world watching, the American president sided with Vladimir Putin, one of America's main adversaries, against his own intelligence agencies, who of course concluded that Vladimir Putin had tried to help him win the 2016 election. And I think the Biden administration shrewdly decided not to hearken back to it, not to create an opportunity where something can go sideways like the way it did there, and to not to not make a show of it, to stick to their plan, which is to, they're there to deliver a message to Putin. They're not hoping for deliverables, and they're not trying to, create a spectacle out of this. I did want to return quickly to the point of whataboutism. Of course, it's, a way of not answering the question, but it works on many people because they always start with a grain of truth, right? And, it's interesting. Yes, the Soviet Union constantly talked about the violation of the civil rights of African Americans in America in the 50s and 60s, and even going back to the 30s. And one of the reasons that the Civil Rights Act was passed and that the American president got behind it was to kind of take this card out of the hands of the Soviets. And, President Biden, politically speaking, is not going into this meeting with a great hand of cards either. Russians are seeing exactly what we're seeing, the voter suppression laws, the, slide toward minority rule, the undermining of our own democracy. So it is a lot harder to talk to, we're seeing black men being killed, black men and women being killed by police constantly in this country. So it is a lot harder to talk to Vladimir Putin about human rights when, we still haven't cleaned up our mess at home.
All right. Thank you so much, Julia Ioffe. Greatly appreciate you being here. Joe Biden walking in. Mika was responding
Very joyful
to that.
entrance.
Joyful entrance while Julia was talking, obviously, about some extraordinarily important things. We had two things going here. But Joe Biden now standing there at NATO, and we're going to obviously be seeing over the next couple of hours what deliverables the Biden administration can get as they prepare for a meeting with Vladimir Putin. Admiral Stavridis, we talk so much in this country, we certainly have over the past 5 years, about Vladimir Putin and the challenges dealing with Vladimir Putin. I always, though, remind those people bringing up Putin that perhaps the only thing more frightening and destabilizing than Vladimir Putin as president of I almost said the Soviet Union, the president of Russia, is what happens after Vladimir Putin. It could be quite chaotic there. He's a man that has absolutely no succession plan whatsoever. And if he were to leave the stage tomorrow, well, anybody that remembers what it was like in the early to mid 90s knows that's not necessarily a good deal for the United States or for international stability. Talk about that.
I can. The way to think about this, having spent a lot of time studying and being around Russians and been to the Kremlin and so on, I will tell you that the Russians, in terms of leadership, they look for strong unitary figures, and they kind of roll the cosmic dice. And one time you get Ivan the Terrible, the next time you get Peter the Great. One time you get Stalin, the next time you eventually find the dice landing on a Gorbachev, and you have glasnost and perestroika. You open again to the West, and that cycle continues. Those dice have landed, Joe, as you correctly point out, on Vladimir Putin, who will be the czar of all the Russians until the day he dies. He's got a firm control on the levers of power. He's got the experience, the intelligence services. He's going to have longevity. The question is, will those cosmic dice roll in a different direction? Our best hope here is that Russia will begin to see that by continuing down the path with China, they will be diminished in that relationship, and that a better option for Russia, an emergent option for Russia, would be a stronger alignment with Europe. Will that happen? We don't know till those cosmic dice roll again. You're probably better off, by the way, than reading the CIA reports. Go back and read Russian literature and read Dostoevsky and Turgenev and understand the complexity of this culture. The bottom line is there's a chance the dice could land on somebody better for the West. I'd say the odds of that, less than even.
Well, and Admiral, we all remember back in the late 80s, early 90s, as the Soviet Union was disintegrating, and even after they did.